Part of Veritas's stated mission is, and I'm quoting from document, wrestle with life's big questions from different points of view with rigor and respect, which I think so many of us really want to participate in. A former dean of Columbia College might say that's practicing beginner's mind, and I think it is. And so we'll try that tonight. The title of our event tonight is the theme of our event, The University and the Good. What is the purpose of the university? And I have flanking me two great both intellectuals and public figures who have thought a lot about this topic and will participate in our discussion and answer your questions. And let me introduce them, starting with our guest. Professor Meghan Sullivan is the Wilsey Family Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame and Director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. She works on questions about time and ethics and teaches Notre Dame's very popular God and the Good Life course. In 2022, Penguin published a book based on the course called The Good Life Method. Professor Sullivan is a graduate of the University of Virginia and Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She also has an interest in fashion, is an expert on the art and business of the designer Thom Browne, and was the inspiration for a major fashion show in New York 2 months ago. As you can tell. Professor Andrew Delbanco is the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, where he has taught for 38 years and shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. He is also president of the Teagle Foundation that promotes liberal education in colleges and universities, in part by supporting programs around the United States based on the Columbia Core and the Columbia Freedom and Citizenship Program. The second edition of his book, College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be, has just been released this week with a new chapter on some of the effects of the pandemic. In addition to being a renowned teacher in the classroom, he has offered classes with Stephen Colbert on the Nitro roller coaster at Six Flags in Central New Jersey, which is available on YouTube, so I recommend you watch it. He's very good at lecturing at 4 times the force of gravity. Anyway, so thank you all for being here. I'm going to start now with our questions, and I'm going to start with what is the purpose of the university, and how should it relate to society at large? And I will start with Professor Sullivan.
Thank you. Thank you guys for hosting me and for turning out tonight. I think it's absolutely incredible. It's a great testament to the Columbia community that so many folks would take time out of a really busy, beautiful Wednesday night to come talk about philosophy and literature with me and Andy. It's pretty awesome. It's also super dangerous to ever ask a philosopher the what is the purpose of X question, because then you better buckle up for like 14 weeks of extremely boring analysis. I'll try not to do that. I think the most interesting version of this question, what's the purpose of a university, is when you ask it in a comparative vein, like what do universities do that other institutions don't do as well? We oftentimes say that the purpose of a university is research, but that's not a great answer because it seems like corporations and large national labs, they do research at a way faster clip and way more intensely than a lot of universities are able to do. So that doesn't distinguish universities, even though a whole lot of research happens here. Another example that comes up quite often is that universities are in the business and colleges are in the business of forming citizens. That's something you hear quite a bit in defense of the liberal arts. But that's also not something that universities distinctly do well. I mean, if we wanted to form you into a great citizen, it'd probably be better for you to do military or national service for 3 or 4 years. Then you'd really understand what it means to be a citizen of this democracy. So what are special about universities? One point, and obviously I'm a partisan on this, is that universities are institutions that are relentlessly devoted to pursuing the truth. A research entity that's not based at a university probably has shareholders or has some funding agency that it needs to serve ultimately with its work. But universities, when they're functioning really well, we believe ought to be independent of those kinds of concerns. So that concern for the truth is really distinctive. And I think about when we talk about forming young people, and that distinctive part of at least the American university system, I think universities are kind of cultural batteries, places where we hold a lot of ideas, whether they're fashionable or not, that we think are hard-won insights that people have developed in the course of, hundreds and hundreds of years of research, in a way that's going to keep transmitting them in good times and bad into the future, preparing people for problems that we might not be able to predict and that are on much longer time horizons than we would start up a corporation or a government entity to try to solve. It's this concern for the truth and this idea of universality, not just universality in the kinds of topics that we take up at a university, but also in like the amount of time that we're willing to, and attention that we're willing to devote to those topics, I think is pretty distinctive about what we do. But be interested if there are alternative perspectives.
Professor Delbanco, do you have an alternative perspective?
Probably not. I think the danger this evening is that we're going to agree on most everything, but we'll see. Maybe we can find something to dispute. A couple preliminaries. First, I want to say this chair doesn't signify that we're waiting for Elijah or anybody else. I just put it here because I wanted some place for my cup of water, right? Professor Sullivan just used the word truth, which, although my Latin is very rusty, I believe is the meaning of the word veritas. And it's sort of intimidating for me to be in the presence of a serious philosopher who's thought a lot about what that word means. I'm going to say something that's going to come across as embarrassing to one person in the room, but I'm not going to apologize for that. It's also something we should take note of, is that we have here with us the faculty member who is, in my view, most devoted to truth-telling in the university right now. That's Professor Thaddeus, who's sitting right over there, whom I admire for a lot of reasons, including the fact that he seems to have an allergy to untruths. So yes, truth is an important element in the university and ought to continue to be. But let me back away from the abstractions for a moment and say a couple of slightly querulous things, I suppose they might be. I'm uncomfortable with the singular word, the university, and maybe even uncomfortable with the singular word, the truth. A first proposition I would put out there is that it's very hard, really, for me anyway, to understand what the university is. We're sitting here at the heart of a university, but to pin down its singular purpose, I think, is a very difficult and maybe quixotic activity. There's a board of trustees that has certain fiduciary responsibilities, but I would suspect that practically every faculty member in the university has a different notion of what the purpose of their work is. We have multiple schools, some having to do with promoting public health, some having to do with improving the standards of journalistic accuracy and freedom. And we have an undergraduate, I'm not going to name them all, we have an undergraduate college, several undergraduate colleges, which I think are probably of particular interest to the people in this room, that have something to do with what Professor Sullivan said, preparing young people for democratic citizenship. That's one of the things the undergraduate schools do. And I won't go on at length because we want this to be a conversation, not a sermon. But whenever this kind of topic comes up, it comes to my mind a building a few yards away from where we're sitting tonight, namely Earl Hall, which is probably a building that some of you have spent some time in, where the university chaplain, I believe, is still headquartered. And over the door of Earl Hall, it says the following, and I wrote it down to make sure I got it accurately. Erected for the students that religion and learning may go hand in hand and character grow with knowledge. Now, I'm in the sort of close reading business, as it were. I'm more or less a literature professor. So I want to spend just a couple minutes closely reading that that sentence and say a couple things that come to my mind when I look at it. First of all, the first phrase, erected for the students. Now, the best teacher I ever had was an intellectual historian, I guess you could say. Helped me to understand that when you see a value proclaimed in a public forum of some kind, in this case, words chiseled in the stone over the door of a imposing building, when you see a principle articulated, it's a good bet that people don't believe it anymore, right? Because if everybody believed that the university was for the students, it wouldn't be necessary to put it out there like that. And in fact, that building, which is on the upper campus at Columbia, is surrounded by lots of other buildings that are not primarily devoted to students, but are primarily devoted to disciplines. There's the philosophy building, the mathematics building, the chemistry building, which is called Havemeyer, because that was a family that gave some money, the physics building, which is called Pupine. In other words, the modern research university was really about pursuit of truth through a variety of methodologies and through a variety of disciplines, and the students were an afterthought in the modern research university. So that building is sort of wagging its finger at the university, in my view, and saying, let's remember the students. Then it goes on and says that religion and learning may go hand in hand. Now, for the first roughly 100 years of this university, that was a true statement. It was founded by the Episcopalian denomination of Protestant Christianity, and it was explicitly devoted to instruction in that particular way of looking at the world, which was considered by those who put it forth to be the truth. But by the late 19th century, when Earl Hall went up, that was ancient history. And it was nostalgic to talk about religion and learning going in hand. The modern research university was quite explicitly hostile to religion in many respects. And finally, and then I'll stop, or at least pause, right? It says, so that character will grow with knowledge. And that, it seems to me, is really the tough part of the proposition there. What does that mean if the university is no longer a singular, unified, unitary community committed to a particular understanding of the world, which it once was? What do we mean by character? And how do we understand character as coupled with the pursuit of knowledge? I'll leave that as a question because I don't know the answer, but I think it might be something worth talking about tonight.
Thank you both. So, you both mentioned students and research. Do you think there's been an evolution of the focus toward research and away from students in, say, the last 20 or 30 years of this or universities generally?
Well, I'll try to answer this one quickly. And then, yes. I mean, anybody who's been around here for a while, at least in the faculty, has to be candid. This is not primarily a teaching institution. The rewards and the incentives for faculty are all lined up behind research. Teaching, we give a lot of lip service to teaching, and I think there are a lot of people here who take teaching seriously and value it, but it's not the currency of the institution, and it's not the currency of any research institution. Liberal arts colleges maybe are a different animal, but we're here to talk about the university. So there is undoubtedly a tension, chronic, perpetual, and irresolvable between the research mission of the university and the teaching mission. Sometimes they go together well. There are ways to try to put them together by inviting undergraduates to participate in research, by bringing your research into the classroom with you. But the idea that this university is primarily committed to teaching is honestly a piece of feel-good fable making, in my view.
I won't try to speak too much to Columbia, only having spent 24 hours here. But I can pontificate on the philosophy of higher ed more broadly. I'm a little bit more optimistic, I think, than Professor Delbanco, just because as long as there have been schools, as long as there's been anything even remotely resembling a higher ed, there have been fights among the teachers about whether or not they were still performing their functions. The Greeks and the Romans, they would start their schools like the academy or like the lyceum, and then they would get sick of the teaching regime, and somebody would break off and start another school that was really going to do it right this time. In the 1800s, you've got John Henry Newman. He's now a saint in the Catholic Church, and he was working at Oxford. He was a huge Oxford don, and he'd gotten really sick of his colleagues. A lot of his writings were railing against the fact that he couldn't see anything that the different departments at Oxford had to do with each other anymore, absent the kind of moral religious decay of the university. And he was expelled from his job when he converted to Catholicism, and then wrote this huge manifesto about how he was going to start his own university in Ireland that was everybody was going to be really unified around a singular moral goal, and it was an abject failure. You see W.B. Du Bois and George Washington Carver hashing it out in the early 1900s about whether or not to best serve young people with HBCUs. We had to offer a technical farming engineering education, or whether or not we had to offer a great books education. Those fights were super bitter. And some of the greatest sociology and philosophy of education in that period came out of those arguments. So I think debates like this, is Columbia doing a good job being Columbia, are really fruitful? And the answer is probably no. The answer for my own university, Notre Dame, is certainly no. There's a kind of essence of what Notre Dame should be, a place that's really committed to seeking the truth and really committed to training people on how to do it. And we're falling short. We could try a lot harder, and pointing out the areas where we think we could try harder is probably where we start to get inspired. But that doesn't mean that we're hopeless. It just means that this is like business as usual, college professors gazing at their navels and feeling upset about institutions that they're deeply committed to and really care about, falling short of this ideal that they have in their mind for what they wish those could be.
Thank you. This was a little bit of a setup on my part, because I want to point out that despite the perception frequently that the emphasis has shifted away from teaching students to research, and I chose the last 20 to 30 years because that's the duration of my tenure at Columbia. But last year, Columbia College had 50,000 applications for a class that has 1,100 students in it. And one way that people frequently establish whether something's valuable or not is to ask how many people want it. So how does one connect the tremendous demand for this experience with questions about whether we're actually doing a good enough job or focusing enough on the very people for whose demand for this experience keeps increasing?
Okay, that's a great question, and let me take it in apologize if it's an obnoxious direction. Most of the people in this room are Columbia College undergraduates, is that right? With some GS students as well? Okay.
And engineering.
And engineering, I apologize, of course. How many of you also applied to Brown?
The truth comes out.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, and I really don't mean to put any of you on the spot, but let's think about that for a minute. Columbia College, if it has a distinctive personality, it has to do with the core curriculum, right? Which is a prescribed series of courses, quite different from many other places, where the institution says you're going to take these courses, so and so many credits, you have to pass these courses in order to graduate. Brown, which is a great institution, is famous for not requiring its students to do anything in particular. I mean, they ought to earn a certain number of points and major in something, I believe, but they don't, there's no prescription as to what they need to study there. So what could we conclude from the fact that, not just some people in this room, and I really am not being critical about this, I was subject to all these forces when I was your age too, certainly. But what can we conclude from the fact that thousands of young people in the United States apply to both of those institutions? And I think the answer was stated in a somewhat cynical book published by Thorsten Veblen about 125 years ago called The Higher Learning in America, which he meant ironically, in which he said, the fundamental product of the university is prestige, right? So I'm sorry to say, I mean, look, I love Columbia. I love my Columbia students. I'm sure I would love all of you if you were in my classes. But the reality is that 50,000 people apply here because it's prestigious, not because, in every case, they've been thinking deeply about what the educational experience is likely to be as opposed to somewhere else. That's my view. It's not a cynical view, but I think it's a realistic view. Prestige is the driving force that runs institutions like this in their competition with one another. And there are some good results from that, and there are some bad results from that. But I think we have to be realistic and say that's the case.
I absolutely agree, at least about the diagnosis of the problem. I mean, in the United States, but I'd say arguably across the developed world right now, we are going through a moment as a human race where our fundamental drives are dictated by late-stage capitalism. We live in a very achievement-oriented society where achievements are measured in terms of how much money you earn, how powerful a position you hold in that society, your ability to optimize on certain variables like how much money you have and how many degrees you accumulated, where you live. We're very much a scorekeeping group of people who believe kind of in upward mobility, but also kind of not, because we start keeping score at preschool for a lot of our young people, and then by the time they get to be your age, things are very much set in stone. That can feel pretty antithetical to everything I said just a few minutes ago about imagining university environments as places that are slow moving, that are places where we hold a lot of ideas together, not just the fashionable ideas, and where we're concerned with the truth. Because probably if we walk across campus, I saw a couple admissions tours when I was on campus today. I highly doubt that the admissions tour guides are saying that to the people who are visiting your university. Instead, they're talking about the great career services, they're talking about the networking opportunities and how living in Manhattan, you're gonna have greater job offers when you leave Columbia. Universities play right into that system. And I think that can be extraordinarily damaging. It's certainly one of the reasons why I think a lot of folks who are not part of our universities are pretty confused about what we do and why this is still a valuable activity. We're not always the best advocates for what we think our goals or our functions are, not always so confident or unified in those goals. So I think that's a genuine problem. I don't stay up late at night worried about the really low admissions numbers at a school like Columbia or Brown. My youngest brother went to Brown, or a place like Notre Dame, because I do think that individual colleges and universities ought to be proud of what they offer to young people. People work really hard to offer those opportunities, and they might not be able to stretch to accommodate 50,000 people in the incoming class of Columbia College. They're a little bit responsible for this weird market demand, but not solely responsible. I mean, late-stage American capitalism is what's really solely responsible for that huge demand. But I do wish that there were more high-quality educational opportunities from high school on up through higher ed available to people, so that it didn't feel like this ride-or-die decision for a 16, 17-year-old to go through this process and make the cut and get sorted into one of these universities rather than somewhere else. I think that's quite damaging to equality in our country. and definitely damaging to our ability to imagine these really lofty goals for universities rather than just serving as a credentialing mechanism for capitalism.
So given that, we have in our audience tonight, at a time of the academic year when there's lots to do, papers to write, exams to take, lots of things, still we have a room full of people, students who are willing to sit here and be part of a discussion like this, who don't seem to be the prestige seekers, because if you were just seeking prestige, you wouldn't come to this event. You'd be out doing as little as possible in order to actually secure the right to that prestige. So when we talk about the purpose of the university, are there actually multiple purposes, and beyond teaching and research, but multiple purposes given the fact that people are here for multiple reasons?
Totally right. I'm glad you put it that way, because a while ago, Professor Sullivan said she was going to be a bit more optimistic than I was being, and I didn't mean really to be pessimistic. I'm just trying to tell it the way I see it. But let me try to put what I was saying earlier a little more positively. I'm not sure we really want to be part of an institution that has one singular unitary purpose, right? There are not very many institutions that meet those criteria. Let's think of corporations, for instance. I mean, we could have a lively and important, I think, debate. What is the purpose of a profit-making corporation? Is the primary purpose to maximize the profits of the shareholders? And some people believe that. Or is the primary purpose to create products that are beneficial to the broader society and create wealth that benefits more people than just those who own stock in the corporation? I mean, I can't think of any entity that doesn't have multiple purposes. Families have multiple purposes. So universities do and should have multiple purposes. And as Jim rightly suggests, you're here because you're interested in this question, presumably. And you're not here, as he says, because you think coming to this is going to be something to put on your resume. I went to this talk on Wednesday, April, whatever the day is, and isn't that a good thing? That's not why you're here. So the university is a place with a lot of freedom and a lot of pluralism and opportunity to shape your time in the university to the ends that you believe in. And I think that's great. And I'm very encouraged when I participate in events like this, or indeed, frankly, when I walk into the classroom here at Columbia, because I think students actually are not really fundamentally after the prestige, and they're not really fundamentally after the economic advancement, although, post-college career is on their minds, quite understandably. I think they are trying to figure out, by and large, how to make a meaningful life. And the university provides a lot of opportunities to think about that question productively with peers who have that same question on their minds. And that's what the core is about, with books that present alternative ways to think about how to make a meaningful life. So I think a lot of great stuff goes on in the university. And actually, I think probably more of it goes on at Columbia than at most institutions because of certain traditions that we have here. But that's not quite the same thing as saying that's what the university is about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to kind of throw some more gasoline on the optimism fire, or at least the what we're striving for fire, I think the very best colleges and universities have all, from the very beginning, from the time Earl Hall got that etched over the doorway, had this dream of being a place where people would come to care for their souls. And this is Socrates' terminology. So the kind of founder of my tradition in philosophy 2,400 years ago says that all of philosophy is a matter of learning to care for your soul. And it's something that you have to learn. It's something that, you have an innate desire to take care of yourself, to pursue a good life. But in fact, you need a lot of help along the way, especially in emerging adulthood, to start to really understand who you are and why you're here and what your life is going to mean with the limited amount of time that you're going to have as part of our civilization and here on planet Earth. Those can be hard questions to wrestle with outside of the university. There are some institutions, religious institutions, try to provide that guidance to people. Maybe really well-functioning families and communities give people tips and hints and nudges along the way. But universities have very idealistically thought that they would really preserve that knowledge and make it accessible to anyone, regardless of their religious background, regardless of which family or community they come from. You can come to a place like Columbia, you can come to a place like Notre Dame, and caring mentors are going to introduce you to some of the skills that you'll hopefully then build on the rest of your life as you try to have a meaningful life. And that's one thing, if we, as we watch humanities programs get gutted at universities, or we watch universities get really fragmented with respect to their vision of what their teaching obligations are, you can be pretty nervous. I get nervous that we are losing that core function or losing our faith that universities are still able to do it. And if we're not doing it, who is? That starts to get very scary indeed.
Can I tell a quick story that I think connects to what Professor Sullivan just said? So, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, maybe around the time that I was working on this little book that was mentioned, and in the days when Columbia administrators invited me to go talk to alumni, which they no longer do, I went to a Columbia alumni event in Washington. And I gave a spiel where I was celebrating the value of the core curriculum. And I said a lot of things about how great the core was, and I put the emphasis on something you mentioned earlier, that the core helped to prepare students for citizenship. And when the talk was over, it was a Q&A, like as we're going to have here tonight in a few minutes. And this one elderly, at least he seemed elderly to me then, not so much now, elderly alumnus stood up and said, "Professor, thank you for your remarks, but I think you missed the main point." And I said to myself, this is what I get back on Morningside Heights from my students. I came here so I could give a speech and you'd all clap and everything, but it's Columbia all the time, 24/7. So I said, okay, what's the main point that I missed? And he said something I'll always remember. He said, Columbia taught me how to enjoy life. And I was really knocked over by that. He didn't mean it in, how to go out to good restaurants and have fun vacations and so on. He meant it in the sense that Professor Sullivan was talking about, how to savor the experience of being alive and the experience of learning and the value of curiosity, and indeed what the core gave him, the ability to go into a museum and have a feeling for what he was looking at, or to listen to music with a sense of what he was hearing. And that was a really great answer that I think at the end of the day is the answer we are all kind of looking for.